Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. So we had Kansas City just beat the Giants by 22-9, but this video is all about tomorrow night with Detroit at Baltimore. So let's take a look. And starting off with our classic team panel, you have the Ravens favored on the money line with a spread of 4.5 and a total point line of 53.5. Looking at our rankings, you have the Lions slightly higher ranked, especially in the passing rank. And it's kind of the opposite for the Ravens with a higher rushing rank, but a much lower passing rank. If we look at the averages, you have 279.5 passing yards on average from the Lions, and 217 average passing yards per game for the Ravens. You have an average of 111.5 rushing yards per game, and you have an average of 141.5 rushing yards per game for the Ravens. You have one interception from the Lions all season, none from the Ravens. 2 sacks suffered on average per game for the Lions, and 2.5 on average for the Ravens. The Ravens have also lost 1 fumble this season. Looking at the defensive information, you have 6 QB hits on average per game for the Ravens, and only 3 for the Lions. They've each gotten 1 defensive interception this season, and the Ravens average 4.5 pass defenses per game, whereas the Lions only average 3. The Ravens average 4.5 passes defended per game. The Ravens average 4.5 passes defended per game, and the Lions only average 3. The Ravens average 1.5 sacks per game, and the Lions average 2 per game. So, looking at a quarterback matchup now, we have Goff with 44.9 fantasy points this season, and Lamar Jackson with 55.7. Goff has had 1 passing interception and 4 sacks suffered, while Lamar has had 5 sacks suffered. As we saw before, Goff averages 279.5 passing yards per game, and Lamar Jackson averages 217 passing yards per game. Your rushing stats really differ from each other since Lamar likes to run the ball a lot more. So on average, you have 4 carries for 41.5 yards, while Goff only gets on average 2.5 yards. Looking at the breakdown by week, you have 225 passing yards and then 334 for Goff, so pretty good numbers up there. 5 passing touchdowns last week. If we look at Lamar Jackson, his weeks are a little bit more consistent and close, with 209 passing yards the first week and 225 passing yards the second week. If we look at the starting running backs, you actually have them pretty close in terms of fantasy points, with 34.4 for Gibbs and 31.5 for Henry, even though Henry had that big first week. Gibbs has had no fumbles, while Derrick Henry has had 2 and lost 1 of them. So on average, you get 56.5 rushing yards from Gibbs, and an average of 96 rushing yards from Henry, an average of 20.5 receiving yards from Gibbs, with an average of 6.5 receptions. So that really helps your fantasy PPR if you have a PPR league. And Henry averages 6.5 receiving yards per game. Looking at the breakdown, they kind of have opposite weeks. So you have 19 rushing yards in the first game for Gibbs, but 94 rushing yards in the second game for Gibbs. Whereas Derrick Henry had 169 rushing yards in the first game and 23 rushing yards in the second game. And just a quick look at the breakdown of receiving yards, you had 13 in the first week for Derrick Henry, but none in the second week. With Gibbs, you had 31 receiving yards with 10 targets and 10 receptions in the first week, and only 10 yards the second week, with 3 receptions. And looking at the receivers, these are considered the number 1 receivers on each team. For Amon-Ra, you have 47.7 fantasy points, and for Zay Flowers, you have 43 PPR fantasy points. So Amon has the slight advantage over Zay Flowers. No fumbles across the board for either of them. They both have a couple carries, an average of a few yards per game, but that's probably not significant compared to their receiving, which is on average 80 receiving yards per game for Amon-Ra and on average 109 receiving yards per game for Zay Flowers. Breaking that down, you have 45 receiving yards in the first game for Amon-Ra and 115 in the second game, while Zay Flowers had 143 receiving yards in the first game and 75 in the second. Looking at their air yard share, you have Zay Flowers, who definitely carries the most for the team. But over here, you have Amon-Ra, who only carries 31.33%, which is still a large chunk, almost a third. But you also have somebody else, which I think is Williams, and we'll take a look here at that in a minute. All right, looking at Jameson Williams, since he's a large portion of the air yard share, so I kind of want to see what he's been doing. And then just for fun, I brought up Hopkins because he has another decent amount of share and has been seeing the ball a lot, so I wanted to see what he was doing. They're about even in fantasy points for PPR. You average 65.5 receiving yards per game for Jameson Williams, and an average of 49.5 per game for DeAndre Hopkins. Looking at their breakdown, you had 35 for Hopkins in the first week, 64 receiving yards in the second week for him. Only 2 targets, 2 receptions, so he made a lot out of those 2 receptions. Which means, he may not be the best option for like a fantasy game since he could boom or bust pretty easily. Looking at Jameson Williams, you have 23 receiving yards in the first game, but 108 in the second. Also only off of 2 receptions, but he had 4 receptions in the first game for only 23. So another kind of boom or bust looking kind of player, even though he had 1 big week. So we'll have to keep an eye on him, see how he keeps doing, see if he continues to perform. So that's all I have for my Monday night review. I hope that you enjoyed, I hope that was helpful, and I hope that you got something out of it. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. And let me know in the comments what I can do better or what else you'd want to see. Thank you so much for watching.